Just a couple days ago, when the U.S. Justice Department unveiled its new ruling on pistol braces and short-barreled rifles, Attorney General of the U.S. Merrick Garland was quoted as saying thus: "Almost a century ago, Congress determined that short-barreled rifles must be subject to heightened requirements." And that's just straight up not true. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and this subject has become very relevant, and so I thought it'd be worth taking a look at the history of short-barreled rifles and their regulation and how this applies to the newly released ruling on pistol braces, which TLDR essentially makes all braced pistols into short-barreled rifles. So in 1934, the US Congress passed the National Firearms Act, and this regulated a number of types of firearm. Now, the intent of this was to prohibit them outright. However, it was recognized at the time that the Second Amendment didn't actually allow an outright prohibition, and so instead, a prohibitively expensive tax was chosen as the mechanism for restricting ownership of these firearms. The tax was $200. The legislation makes no allowance for that tax to change with regards to inflation, and so it is still $200 today. However, in 1934, a $200 tax was many, many times the cost of most of the guns that were regulated by the Act. For example, silencers at that time cost between $3 and $7. A $200 tax on a $3 to $7 item is obviously intended to be prohibitive. At any rate, that's not the point that I want to make here. The relevant point is that the National Firearms Act regulated machine guns, destructive devices today, but that would actually come in an amendment later in the 1960s, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and an extra sort of vague category entitled any other weapons. One might wonder, is Attorney General Garland correct in that short-barreled rifles and short-barreled shotguns were seen as a particularly criminal threat, a threat from the criminal element? And the answer is no, because originally, as it was written, the National Firearms Act would have also subjected handguns to these same restrictions, and that was largely the intent of the National Firearms Act. It wanted to target the scary guns that were viewed as being used by criminals, and those were handguns and machine guns. However, before the act was actually passed, lobbyists successfully removed the handguns from the scope of the legislation. Now, the whole reason that short-barreled shotguns and short-barreled rifles were included in this was not because they specifically were considered a problem, but because they were seen as a loophole in a prohibition or a prohibitive tax on handguns. Because what's the point in banning a handgun if I can just go take a rifle, cut the stock off, cut the barrel off, and now I have a little short concealable rifle. It's going to be kludgy and clumsy and awkward, but that really kind of fits the criminal use case anyway. We just cut those off and all of a sudden, well, officer, it's not a handgun, it's clearly a rifle. And so short-barreled rifles and shotguns were included in this bill as a closure of a loophole of how you could get a handgun that isn't technically a handgun. The big problem was that, and this hasn't been fixed in the virtually 90 years since this law was passed, is that those loophole closures weren't removed when the handgun section was removed. So we are left in this really quite absurd legislative or legal position today where a handgun, if I can do this without everything falling over, this handgun is totally legal. I can buy this from a dealer without anything beyond a general background check. In states that allow private purchases, I can just buy this from another person. No big deal. I can also buy this without any particular extra oversight beyond what is required to buy a firearm in general. This is clearly a rifle. It's long. However, this, which falls squarely between those previous two, is subject to what was at the time intended to be a prohibitive federal tax, as well as the oversight of having to submit photographs, fingerprints to the FBI, and wait it's not a legal mandated waiting period, but the practical waiting period, because the amount of time that it takes ATF to process the form to legally own this, to pay the tax on it so that you can own it, is These days, 6 to 9 months. It varies with the new regulation declaring all sorts of extra things to be short-barreled rifles. The waiting time for this to be processed is almost certainly going to jump above a year, and who knows how long it will actually go. But let me remind you, this, according to Attorney General Garland, is prohibited or is regulated because it is particularly dangerous because it's concealable. And yet, this, which is clearly more concealable, is not. You see the absurdity. Now, the National Firearms Act has not been static since 1934 when it was first passed. It's been changed twice in ways that are relevant to what we're looking at today. The first change was in 1936 when a number of manufacturers of .22 caliber sporting rifles, plinking rifles, small game hunting rifles, wrote to Congress or to the government and essentially said, look, this barrel length prohibition is really creating a problem for us. Like, we sell a lot of guns, we make a lot of guns that have barrels shorter than this, and they're .22 caliber hunting rifles. They have no place in the criminal world. Like, this isn't the sort of gun that you're trying to ban, but your law has banned them, and this is putting undue imposition on our business. Could you please change it? And in 1936, they did. And what they did was they exempted .22 caliber rifles with barrels longer than 16 inches. That's right, 16. Now, if you are intimately familiar with the NFA, you will know that the legal barrel length limit, the legal minimum for a rifle, at which point it becomes a short-barreled rifle, is 16 inches today. We'll get to that change in a moment, because for shotguns, you have to have an 18-inch barrel. We have an odd dichotomy where it's 18 inches for a shotgun, but it's 16 inches for a rifle, and these are allegedly based on the same idea of concealability. So why is there a difference in the barrel lengths between the two? Well, for .22 caliber rifles, it became 16 inches in 1936, specifically to basically let some of these guns that were obviously not what Congress was trying to control out of the loop. Now, a further issue came up in 1963, or rather in 1968. So in 1963, the US government starts surplusing M1 carbines. The M1 carbine has a 16.25 inch long barrel. In 1963, the US government sold just about 250,000 of them to NRA members. And it occurred to someone at some point after they all went out the door that every single one of those was, in fact, an NFA violation. Every single one of those was legally a short-barreled rifle. That's a big whoopsie. This is, in fact, fairly similar to what we have today, which is that in 2012, the first pistol brace was submitted to ATF for ruling. Is this, if we put this on a pistol so you can strap it to your arm and have improved stability, especially for people who have perhaps handicaps, would that constitute a short-barreled rifle? And ATF looked at it and said, well, no, it wouldn't. And again, kind of an oops, because pretty quickly people started realizing that I can take this brace and I can just stick it on my shoulder like a stock, and it pretty much works the same way. It's a little less comfortable, but I can shoot the gun much more effectively that way than I can strapping this thing to my arm. Now, the ultimate result of that whoopsie today is ATF coming back after there are millions. ATF estimates there are 3 to 7 million pistol braces in private hands in the United States today. The Congressional Research Service says that it's actually more like between 10 and 40 million of these things. And the ATF's response has been to declare them all contraband. Well, possessing the thing is sort of legal. If you don't have a gun, you can put it on. Putting it on a gun, you've now created a short-barreled rifle, and the penalty for this, by the way, is a $250,000 fine and a 10-year sentence in federal prison as a felon. You might think that this is a bit out of scale for the severity of the crime, which of course has no actual victim in the first place at all. One might suspect that if a criminal wanted to conceal a firearm, they could acquire a pistol instead of register a $200 tax for a short-barreled rifle with a pistol brace on it. At any rate, the solution to the oopsie in 1963, when all of these things got sold out onto the market by the government themselves, was to come back in 1968 and include a clause in the Gun Control Act that changed the minimum barrel length from 18 inches to 16 inches for all rifles. So as of 1936, the length was 16 inches for a .22. As of 1968, it becomes 16 inches for everything. They acknowledged, presumably, that they made a mistake. They recognized that this mistake had no actual impact on crime or concealability of firearms. Possibly, they don't say this, but possibly in part because it was recognized that this whole short-barreled rifle thing is a farce from the very beginning, because the one element that it's supposed to protect against, people cutting down rifles to make handguns, is completely moot because there is no tax or prohibition on handguns. So the response the first time this sort of mistake happened was to acknowledge the problem and recognize that it wasn't really actually a problem and amend the law to let people keep the stuff that they had that they weren't doing anything wrong with. Today, we ought to do the exact same thing. I would like to propose that there is in fact one very simple, very straightforward, and what ought to be clearly obvious solution to this entire arm brace debacle. And that solution is take short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and any other weapons off of the NFA. There is in fact no reason for them to be there. There has been no reason for them to be there since the law was passed 89 years ago. Now, obviously, we live in a very polarized political society. I'm sure 50% of the people out there who see this, well, I'm sure one side of the political spectrum is going to hear that argument and say, rah, rah, absolutely, of course, that's clearly what we should do. And the other half is going to say, no, we shouldn't. These things are, in some way, a detriment to society. They're a danger. I propose that the only rationale for keeping these guns is an idea that handguns should also be banned and that further classes of firearms should, in fact, be banned, something that the Supreme Court and the Second Amendment don't actually allow under our form of government. However, I would also point out that, like I said a moment ago, the Congressional Research Service says there are between 10 and 40 million of these pistol braces out in private hands. If these are actually a problem, law enforcement needs to do something to get them. However, ATF has said that it does not expect to expend any substantial investigative enforcement authority on collecting them. And so we have a rather hypocritical situation here of, if they are a danger, they ought to be, like, this law ought to be enforced and they should be rounded up and taken in because they're a danger. But if they're not going to be, well, if they're not a danger, then there's no real need to collect them, right? Which is what the ATF has said it's going to do. Frankly, it's pretty obvious that they're not a problem. There are tens of millions of these things out there, and tell me the last time you saw more than maybe one crime that was committed using them. Instead, I would propose that by removing these classes of firearms from the NFA, ATF can take its somewhat limited resources and apply them to legal penalty or violations of the law crimes that actually have victims that are actually negatively impacting our society. And that is not the fact that this is due special regulation compared to either that or that. This is a nonsense law that is left over from an attempt at legislation that didn't actually happen. So if you would prefer to see ATF actually following up on crimes like gun smuggling by drug runners into Mexico, something that is worth their time and effort and that they can do a good job on, they shouldn't be wasting their time trying to track down pistol braces. This actually isn't a pistol brace. This is actually a registered short-barreled rifle, and has been because I wanted the actual appropriate stock on it. Anyway, I know I don't normally get political on this channel, and I would like to think that this really isn't a political question, or it shouldn't be a political question, because this is a pretty self-evident problem, or lack of problem in some ways. I recognize that people have entrenched opinions on things, and it can be very difficult to reevaluate an opinion to what feels like surrendering it to the other side. But what we have here is an opportunity for 10 to 40 million Americans to not become felons by fiat overnight, and also for ATF to be able to rededicate its resources to the problems that are really problems. Anyway, we'll be back tomorrow with a really cool forgotten weapon. Actually, I believe tomorrow is a 1913 German World War I parabellum machine gun, which is really quite cool. Hopefully, you got some value out of this. Hopefully, I mean, I don't see a huge likelihood for it given our political climate today, but it would be really nice if we could do the obvious common sense thing and take these classes of firearm out of the NFA where they shouldn't have been in the first place. Thanks for watching.